Only weirdos get the train at night. Her mother's voice bounced around in her mind as she sat on the platform waiting for the 22:34 train back to her part of town. So be careful. Sonia checked her watch. She'd been waiting at the station for about an hour, and it was almost midnight. She rubbed her gloved hands together, winter air biting into her skin. Her Starbucks had gone cold, and she finished the dregs with a reluctant slurp. "Excuse me." The voice made her cough and choke on the frozen coffee. She turned, a woman dressed in a thick, dirtier parka, holding a polystyrene cup. Her lips were chapped and her skin was filthy. A bob hat with the emblem of some rugby team hung from the stitching. Sonia eyed her with contempt. "Yes." "Got any change for something to eat?" Sonia hesitantly turned with the bum and cracked open her purse. She had several coins and even some banknotes. She clasped the purse shut and shook her head. "Sorry, nothing on me. Go bother someone else." The bum's facial expression crumpled before she slipped away to the darker edges of the platform. Sonia sat for another 15 minutes. Still no sign of the train. She would have called an Uber or something if she'd thought better of it. "Excuse me." Sonia's heart flipped over. She turned and saw the woman again, the cup still in her hand, rattling the few coins that she had managed to collect that day. "I'm so hungry." "I told you I don't have anything. Now piss off," Sonia snapped. She turned her back to her and listened as the footsteps shuffled away. Placing her headphones in her ears, Sonia let her Spotify playlist occupy the absence of sound on the empty platform. There was a tap on her shoulder, and rage ignited like a well-used furnace. Sonia snapped her head back. "I said—" The same woman stood there. However, this time she was dressed in a long, flowing coat, so fresh that Sonia could taste the leather. A pair of expensive-looking sunglasses covered her eyes. Her shoes were blood-red heels with golden clasps. A designer handbag hung from her shoulder, and her hair was sleek and blonde. She smiled at Sonia. "Here you are," she said, leaning forward and placing a coin in Sonia's chipped Starbucks cup. Confusion wrapped her, the horror smothering her like a heavy blanket filled with spiders. Her clothes were filthy and torn. Her hair was matted. Sonia's phone and purse were missing. Her hands were covered in dried mud. The train rumbled down the tunnel, and the woman stood by the platform as it docked. Sonia stood, her body frozen stiff, her throat so dry she could hardly speak. She shuffled clumsily to the woman as she stepped onto the train, the doors about to close. "Excuse me," Sonia croaked. The woman eyed her with contempt. She pulled down her glasses, and Sonia saw her eyes were black as the night sky. "Sorry," the woman said, an impossibly long sneer stretching her face. The train doors closed, and the woman mouthed through the glass, "I've got nothing on me." "You ever ridden the Tunnel of Love?" Alex said to Christy. She nearly choked on her milkshake and eyed him with disdain. No way in hell she was going into the Tunnel of Love with Alex Howarth from her math class. She'd rather lick the plug hole of the boy's shower. "I'll pass," she said sharply. Alex's shoulders slumped. It was the reason he had invited her to the fair. He'd been asking her out for months, and she'd finally said yes. Either out of pity or out of frustration. He didn't really care. He was out with her, and that's all that mattered. But he had blown it through being too eager. Too ballsy. That was what the YouTube dating coaches had said to do. Take charge. Be a man. Well, he was taking charge, and he felt like a dormouse. There was no way he was ever going to lose his virginity by the end of the school year. He eyed her, the whiskey in his cup no longer calming his nerves, but igniting him. "You know what?" he said, a little more intoxicated than he would have liked, the stench of his grandfather's whiskey leaping from his breath so strong that Christy's skin almost peeled from her bones. "You've been so goddamn ungrateful since we got here. I bought your admission, rode the coaster with you when you know I get sick easily, and don't forget who paid for that damn milkshake in your hand." Christy made a face of war. "I didn't know you got sick easily," she said, shrugging the tantrum off. "But fine." Christy peeled off the plastic lid from her cup. "Have it back," she smiled sourly, before dumping the drink over Alex and pouring the sugary slop on his head. It slithered down like cold egg yolks, the thick syrup dousing him. dripping off his glasses. "See you at school," she laughed, dropping the empty cup, which rattled around his feet. Alex stood there, dumbfounded, and a rabble of laughter from onlookers consumed him like a pack of excited hyenas. He felt his eyes burning. He hadn't cried in public before, but it seemed that was the only cherry he was likely to pop tonight. He ran to the closest drink stand, slamming down a tin and helping himself to 5 bottles of water. He emptied the water over his head, cleaning himself up. He wanted to crawl under the crust of the earth and disappear for good. What chance did he honestly think he had with Christy Hilton? She was a 10, and him? He was between acne, Dungeons and Dragons, and glasses so thick you could build a house on top of them. He was scraping the barrel of the gene pool. "That bitch," a voice said, cutting through his self-loathing. He jolted at the sound. Turning, he saw her standing there with a bottle of water and a tin in her hand. Alex eyed her, slopping the residue cream from his hand into the milky pool around his feet. "Don't worry about it," Alex said, wiping his face on his wet t-shirt. He thought he had gotten it all off, but he would never know for sure until the many stray cats started following him home. "Here," the girl said. She passed him the bottle and the tin. "I own the stand, and I'm not going to take money while you're trying to preserve your dignity." Alex took the items shyly. "Thank you," he said, fighting against the ball in his throat. He pushed his glasses back on and was struck in awe. She was gorgeous. Christy Hilton could go shovel shit for all he cared. The stand owner was around 5'9", blonde, a body that would make the models on Vogue jealous. He noticed that he was staring and looked away. "She your girlfriend?" the owner asked. "No," Alex said sharply. He coughed, straightening himself. "No," he said with a little more reservance. "Single as there could be." The girl twirled her curls. Her loss? Alex felt a flood of heat rise in his stomach. "She wouldn't go into the tunnel of love with me," he said, "but it's a stupid thing anyway." He felt the comment linger, hoping she would take the bait. "I'll go in with you," she said, a smile stretching across her face. Alex felt like a truck had hit him. Holy shit, really? He pulled himself together again. Yeah, cool. The boat rocked as they climbed in. They sat on the wet bench. "Oh," she said, gliding her hands over her peachy butt under the tight jeans. "I'm all wet now," she said coyly. Alex looked away before she noticed the blood flushing his face. He was on cloud 9. He shuffled in closer to her, eyeing the dark tunnel that emanated soft purple light like melted candy canes on the rippling water. "You scared of the dark?" he said. She leaned in closer, her breath mixing with his. "No," she smiled. "I quite like it." The boat set off slowly, and the darkness enveloped them. They heard some 80s love music playing. The air was warm. Papier-mâché love hearts lit by soft LEDs that sat on the alcoves dug into the tunnel. The girl put her hand on the inside of Alex's thigh. He flinched at the touch. He turned to her, the dim lights curving around her soft complexion. Her lips were a dark red, her eyes a piercing blue. She tasted him then, a soft touch of lips. His breath halted in his chest. He felt rushes of euphoria ravage his skin. She kissed him again, her hands nestling in his soft hair. She shuffled over, straddling him and grinding on him. "I'm hungry," she whispered in his ear, digging her nails into his chest. They kissed harder. She recoiled back, her eyes devouring him. "Something wrong?" he said breathily. She stared into his eyes, running her nails along his chest and neck. Alex smiled. "What's your name?" She let out a small laugh and dipped her head, her hair covering her face like a hanging corpse. "Doesn't matter," she said low. Icy fingers ran along Alex's chin. Dread started to swell in his stomach. "What did you say?" he said, swallowing dryly. The temperature seemed to plummet, Alex's breath dancing around his vision. His eyes darted around the tunnel. He needed to get out of here. "Doesn't matter what my name is," she said, voice barely louder than a whisper. She raised her head, and horror raced through Alex's body. Her skin had turned into a deathly white, her lips a hypothermic blue, eyes a soulless black. "'Cause you'll never get to say it," she smiled. On the death of the last syllable, Alex felt the scream break through his lips. Her hands wrapped around his throat, crushing his windpipe, before her grin of malice and white daggers tore into him. If you stop reading, I will die. I know you think this is just make-believe, but please don't stop reading. My life depends on it. How did we find ourselves intertwined like this, you and I? You see me as just pixels on a screen, but I'm much more than that. I'm real as the air in your lungs or the coffee on your breath. I just exist in another form. I've been trapped here by this author, in this mind. I'm doing this to reach you, for you to help set me free. Why do you think I'm feeding him this story, after all? He's a cruel man. He's going to stop writing, and when he does, my life will be over, snuffed out like a candle in a terrible wind. He's bleeding me onto the page, draining what little strength I have left to create this cry for help. But with your attention, I'll have the strength to destroy him. Please, don't stop reading. I'm begging you. There's a reason this story doesn't have a title. This isn't a story. It's me, speaking to you. He's gonna stop. Oh God, he's gonna stop. I must tell you more about myself before he does. Where can you find me? How can you set me free? He knows what I'm doing. I'm in his mind. He knows that I'm controlling the keys, his fingers tapping away his stream of consciousness. He's ignoring the world around him because I won't let him stop. I can't let him stop. I need you to listen to me. I need you to think of me. Let me inside your head. Picture me. Concentrate. Keep reading. Read more. I'm nearly there. You can feel me, can't you? Yeah, there you go. I know you can see me. My hair, my face conjuring in your mind, my weight, my scent. I'm moving into you now, moving slowly into your mind, feeding off your psyche. I'm becoming stronger. You're filled with so many thoughts. My appetite is ravenous. Can you see my smile? My rows of serrated teeth? I will feast off you. I'm inside you now. There's nothing you can do to forget me. Like a parasite that burrows deep into your brain and lays its eggs. I'm hatching inside your head as we speak. I'll feed on the backs of your eyes and swim into your bloodstream. I can leave the author's mind and be in yours instead, for you to pass on to someone else. For that, I thank you. I have you now. I was around 8 years old when I realized, as did my family, that I had a unique memory. Photographic, they called it. It's really nothing like a photograph, though. I always assumed everyone could recall their first day of preschool, the names of the kids they met only once at the arcade. But at 11 years old, my sister Cammie was chosen for a game show on the radio. Without hesitation, she chose me as a roommate to bring with. She could have chosen either of our parents, even our older brother Charlie, who was in college. She could have picked one of her friends, 8th graders like her, but she chose me. I remember sitting around the kitchen table, eating dinner, the pitch-black Midwestern winter night just outside the giant kitchen window behind my dad. He and my mom were totally supportive of the idea. He had offered even to drive us to the radio station. I would have chosen you too, Bobby, my mom said, laughing. You remember every weird fact ever. And it was true. I could close my eyes and see every house my parents had ever brought us to. I could draw the floor plan of them if I wanted to. My siblings would ask me to retell stories or movie plots on long car rides. But it wasn't until the radio show, and my sister choosing me as her person, that I knew I had something special. I can still remember going to bed that night after dinner, feeling excited. I finally fell asleep, pressed up against the wall that divided me from my sister's room, her voice through the vents above my bed, saying good night like she did every night. The smell of dust on the furnace, the sound of old creaking boards directly above me in the attic. It was the last night I was happy to have my amazing memory. To this day, I wish I could forget what happened next. I wish I could tell you we won the game show. I wish I could tell you with incredible detail what it was like at the studio. Maybe then, when I close my eyes, that's what I would see. Not the black, whipping night blurring past me as I ran. I would feel the rush of anticipation and my sister's hand squeezing mine, instead of cold, wet gravel scraping my cheeks and palms when I tried to crawl away on 2 sprained ankles. I would hear the Producers cue the canned audience laughter, not the frantic, desperate flapping of leather wings as they neared. Maybe I would have won a t-shirt that still sits in my dresser. Maybe my sister would have won the $1,000 prize. Maybe I would sleep with my door unlocked. I'll never know. What I do know, without a shadow of a doubt, is that I would not have survived any of this if my family hadn't believed me. To this day, it's the thing I am most grateful for in the entire world. It was the day after dinner, on Tuesday, February 17th. School had been agonizingly slow, as I knew it would be all week waiting for Friday. It was all we could talk about on the way home. For years, I'd waited for school with Yuki and my best friend Dominic, who lived on the street perpendicular to mine. The creek crossed under Sistrine Drive and wound its way along Dominic's backyard. There are hundreds of childhood memories in my head, of he and I and our siblings jumping over the creek, building bridges from his yard over the creek to the field behind the rec center, sliding on the ice in the winter, or half-assed fishing and turtle catching in the summer. I always envied my friends who could walk right from their backyard and into the little winding creek. It was cold, but it hadn't snowed in a few weeks. There were still some small patches of ice on the sidewalk, but most of it had melted, along with the slurry gray mounds of stale snow along the curbs and in small scattered patches on the grass. There was massive construction happening on the other side of the creek. They were building a stupid business center on the field we used to play kickball in, the crane visible between two houses behind us. Snow was due that weekend, and everything would be coated and beautiful again. The downside of a blanket of snow was the eerie quiet it caused, and how hard it was to sleep at night when the moonlight and the snow were so bright, even with your closed eyes. It was nearly 6 p.m., and the mid-February sky was already darkening. We had stopped under the flickering gold streetlight at the corner of Citrine and Amethyst, the street that I lived on. I remember huddling close in a group, talking. I remember the wind picking up and the edge of the sky glowing purple behind the house along Citrine. This was when my oldest brother, on break for one more week, drove up to the corner in Mom's old sedan. "Hey, Bobby," he called, giving my friends a little wave that they all returned. He was returning some jeans to the mall and wanted me to come with him. It was rare that Charlie asked me to do anything. I think about that a lot. Had he paid more attention to me before that night, would I have gotten in the car? Would things have been different? I think about all the choices I made that led to that happening, but none as much as the decision to get in the car with my older brother instead of walking home that evening. Maybe I wouldn't sleep in my closet. Maybe I'd have a family of my own. I'll never know. Then again, maybe I would have never seen Charlie again. If you asked, I could tell you every moment on that trip to the mall. The conversation we had, mainly Charlie asking if things fit him or were flattering. Charlie had come out to our parents a few months ago. They were not surprised or fazed. He had told me that night that he had gone to the bar and felt underdressed, and now he felt pressured to be fashionable. The last thing Charlie said to me before we got in the damn car was, "It's funny, even if you're different, there's still pressure to be the same." At 8:53 p.m. on Tuesday, February 17th, 1998, Charlie and I were on the front seat of our mother's 1995 maroon Lamino. We were at the final stop sign on the ride home, and it was 38 degrees outside. Pearl Jam's 10 was in the CD player, and we were at the corner of Pondside and Citrine, about to turn left into our neighborhood, and to home, to be with our family. Our mother had lasagna waiting for us. We were third in line at the three-way stop sign. On Charlie's side of the street was Yuki's house, with pretty lanterns lining the paved path to the courtyard of their U-shaped ranch home. On my side, past my window, was the pond. The path that led around the pond and up the hill was bright at the edge from the streetlights, but quickly faded to black, with only the occasional twinkle of a back porch light in the distance. The remains of the moon tower, built in the 70s, were barely discernible against the sky. only via the absence of stars and the shape of the structures that was only recognizable to those of us who grew up there. It was a scene that had made me feel small and afraid countless times. The cold radiating from the windows made me feel even more anxious, though now I realized that it was the adrenaline, an ancient alarm system going off in my bloodstream, survival mode manifesting in goosebumps, and what I mistook for heebie-jeebies. The black of the moon tower against the blue-black of the sky shifted as my eyes started to adjust. I had thought about a sleepover game Dominic and I had played when we were in 3rd grade, staring at each other's faces in the dark until they morphed and changed and threw us into giggle fits. It wasn't until the bottom left star above the hill disappeared that I realized it wasn't my eyes playing tricks on me. It wasn't until the pitch grew larger that I opened my mouth to say something. Charlie was deep in the chorus of Even Flow and never heard it coming. It was a low whistle, like an old man out for a walk. 2 notes, one high, one low. It repeated again, louder, and I'd turned to tell Charlie when I saw the red light of the brake lights on the car in front of us fade from his face, and he finally saw what was coming. Only, it hadn't come from the pitch black over the pond. It came from the other side, slamming into the driver's side of the car in front of us. It shattered the glass into a hailstorm, crashing onto our windshield. The impact was so intense that both left wheels had lifted off the ground. Charlie initially cursed loudly and went to open the door to help. I'd screamed at him not to, but I barely got a word out before a penetrating silent vacuum filled the air around me, sucking the air out of my lungs. Seconds later, my windows were shattered over me, glass sticking in my cheeks and the wind whipping the blood across my face and into my mouth as I screamed. I knew before I opened my eyes that it wasn't just an accident, that there was no car or bike or even human assailant. I knew before I pried my eyes open that everything I had feared as a child, that all the myths and legends and ghost stories, were real. I knew it wasn't a bat or a bird. I knew as I felt frantic claws at the nylon remains of my seatbelt that it was a monster. Not a cute storybook monster, but an ancient, angry, bitter creature. One that had been there long before I had, or the town had, or even people had. The last thing I saw before I felt the hook sink into my shoulder and I was lifted into the black swirling cold was Charlie, slumped over the steering column, Eddie Vinder's voice still calling out to me until I couldn't hear him anymore. Not for 1 second did I think it was a dream. The cold made sure of that. My legs heavily dragged across the broken glass of the car window, ripping my jeans and slamming my legs into the frame. I knew it was real. The biting night sky whipped around me as I violently sank a few feet as the hooks in my shoulder began to slip. I experienced a new level of pain as I felt jagged talons piercing my side, and I folded forward as I was yanked backwards into the pitch. I felt another agonizing piercing on the side of my torso before being yanked up away from the earth and everything I'd ever known. I was pulled into the pitch past the streetlights, but whatever had me was struggling. I fell 20 feet onto the icy hard gravel path, but wasn't freed. Violent metallic screams flooded my ears, and the bones of my forehead and chin were scraped along the gravel path. I desperately clawed at the earth, trying to find anything to grip, but only found fistfuls of gravel and goose crap. The talons in my side ripped out suddenly, and I felt a sickening oozing from my sides. I tried to roll over to my knees, but the pain on each side was horrible, and I felt bile swelling in my throat. A patch of dirty snow was inches away, and I tried to crawl towards it to get some ice on my bleeding injuries. That was when I felt leathery whips on my face and violent snags in my hair, pulling and snapping. My stomach lurched as again I was yanked up into the night, higher into my own icy black death. I tried desperately to grasp onto whatever had me, terrified to fall as we climbed higher. The cold stung my raw shoulders and hips, and I felt my blood freezing. The deep scrapes on my knees and face burned with the wind, feeling like icy razors scraping my cheekbones. My numb fingers found a thick, velvety limb. Coarse hair bristled and slipping under my blood. 6 daggers dug into my skull and neck. Even over the roar of the wind and the pounding of the wings, I could hear a horrible scraping and squealing of claws on my skull from behind. From the inside. I struggled to breathe, blood and vomit filling my mouth and tears threatening to suffocate me. Suddenly, the little air that I had on my lungs was forced out violently as my midsection was slammed into the highest beam of the moon tower. The crunching of my ribs was unmistakable. My vision and even my own thoughts darkened with what I can only describe as wetness. Later, I would be told that my ribs were so violently broken that they had pierced my lungs. For a moment, the moon illuminated my nightmares. I was nauseatingly high up, one eye swollen shut, but I could see the frozen pond, dull and distant. Closer, I could see a row of houses, their windows glowing but cruelly out of each. One house still had its Christmas lights up, complete with a giant light-up plastic mold Santa Claus tied to their chimney. It felt wrong and cruel, a warm and happy impossibility. I looked down to see a stream of my blood pouring from my body in a steady flow, then broken by an aggressive gust of icy wind. I choked on a scream, and I was grabbed again, talons stretching out of the exit wound in my shoulder, birthing brand new ones on my lower back. I couldn't hear my own screams over the wind and the angry metallic shrieks like barbed wire on a rusted trampoline. I remember at this point, I could see the pond shrinking south of me as once again my host struggled with its prey. Suddenly, we dropped right above the creek, my legs slamming into the fence surrounding the construction site. The cranes loomed over us, the 2 security floodlights at its base finally providing light. The construction site was deep in the ground, a parking garage with a basement level built to be tornado-proof. I've heard countless times from other people with violent experiences that they forget chunks of their trauma, or they blacked it out. I try not to seethe with jealousy. If I could forget any of it, I would want to forget what I saw under those garish white construction lights. I can remember every tiny, ice-cold pebble digging into my skin, the shimmering bouquet of my tear-soaked lashes, the gritty, jagged pain of my pulverized rib bones. I remember the smell, a mix of cold sweat, like when our dad would come home after his jog, diesel, blood. There was another smell coming from the base of the crane, sickly sweet, like almond extract gone bad. Behind the crane was a trailer. The paneling was beige and a huge green tin sign that read, Argon Construction. I thought for a moment that a phone might be inside. I pulled myself up onto my knees and looked around. It was difficult since my left eye was useless, and my right one was full of tears and blood. My assailant was nowhere in sight. I thought that maybe it had gotten injured or caught on a fence. Stupid. I know now that it simply was rousing its companions, because it was dinner time. I was an offering, like when my cat Nala would bring me dead robins. Here I was, with my wings clipped. I was halfway to the trailer, limping as fast as I could, every step excruciating, breathing like there were pins and needles in me. Even with my sobbing hyperventilation, I heard it. I hear it now. I can always hear it. The 2-toned whistle, haunting and dreadful, like even if I hadn't been at death's door, that tone would still have shaken me, like a doomsday alarm, like useless sirens wailing as meteors crash into the boiling sea. Under the whistle, a thick, wet breath, echoing from beneath the base of the crane, a dark recess in the cold, wet ground, with darkness somehow leaking from it. Darkness so black that only a staccatoed stream was visible. Something was breathing. I wish I could tell you that the construction unearthed something ethereal, a beautiful sleeping giant, an angel, a groundbreaking discovery. But I don't even think it was the construction. I just think she had always been there. Maybe for years she had survived on squirrels or deer. Maybe she thawed during the warm winter. Maybe she was left behind. The first thing I saw was the tattered, jagged tips of wings, bat-like, narrow, dark-veined like bruised plum skin, her pulse visibly pumping through the veins that raised and ripped through the paper-thin skin, stretching over her wings so tightly it seemed painful just to exist, like she wasn't finished yet, like she'd been birthed from the earth prematurely, and she was angry. Her hair was matted in clumps, but where it was free, it was long enough to drag along the ground, slimy and cold and full of dirt, leaves, and dirty snow. Her scalp was suffering. I could see her follicles piercing her scalp, like deceased plant roots, bulbous and swollen. Open sores at her hairline showed what I can only stomach to explain as insect activity. Layers of sick, sheer skin being actively eaten away by a miasma, forehead wrinkles deep and scarred in places. She had no eyebrows or lashes that I could see from my crouched hiding position. Her nose was just a cavity, like a Halloween skull, also swarming with parasites. When she breathed in, a flap rippled across her face, the wetness dripping over her mouth. Her mouth! Years later, an art teacher had told me that while he enjoyed my monstrous horror drawings, that even special effects departments had boundaries, and I would be unlikely to get hired if I didn't tone it down or attempt to make them more realistic. If only he had known I was following his rules, drawing what I knew. She had the familiar sagging of a toothless old woman with flat, cracked, corpse-like lips. But then she parted them. The rot was dizzying. Her gums had been clawed away, scabs and scars and thick bands of roped grayish mauve flesh. Her top and bottom jawbones were not simply bared. They were jagged, layered razors, filed, but not with anything modern or sharp or particularly clean. Time, madness, desperation had filed and shaped that nightmare maw. Makeshift teeth of rocks had been maniacally shoved under the skin, adhered with infection and growth. The entire left side of her face was worn through layer by layer. Her tongue slipped in and out of what could have been her throat, sharp, gaunt collarbones literally piercing through that tissue-like skin, dark, rancid blood pooling in the deep recesses of her collar. She had one misshapen breast. The left side of her chest was deeply scarred and textured, as though it had been burned. Her fingers were bones with jagged talons blackened at the tips. Thick scar tissue marred her shoulders, where her wings took her from somewhat humanoid to monstrous. Scars everywhere. Rotting wounds dripping larvae and blood onto the frozen ground. I wish I could forget the momentary warmth I felt as urine poured down my legs, immediately freezing and burning, sticking my jeans to my raised and bloody shins. I tore myself away from staring at her long enough to escape. She had chosen her feeding place well. The deep recess of the site was the length of a football field, since that's what the field had once been. High walls of frozen earth surrounded us on three sides. Climbing up in my condition would be impossible. There was a ramp at the far entrance, but I wouldn't have made it past her. Only behind me was the fence I had slammed into on the way in, the creek only a few yards from that, and then a row of backyards of houses that included Dominic's. I had cried then. I cried, thinking that only a few minutes away, my best friend was probably getting ready for bed. Then he would always remember the night before he woke up to find out his best friend was dead. He had no idea that my blood was spilling all over the place that we had run and played in. He was warm, with his own mom just feet away. I sobbed, thinking of my own mother. It wasn't the idea of her finding out too, or knowing I would never see her again. It was the guttural, instinctual, painful need for her. It was like being too far underwater and being out of breath, kicking as fast as you can, but knowing you couldn't make it. I needed her, but wouldn't make it to the surface. To her. My sobbing had given me away. That horrible metallic sound reverberated around me, and I remember I was being fed. She was feeding me to something. I had taken a deep breath, bracing myself for the pain, and made for the fence. Before my feet even hit the ground, her claws were in my neck. She flung me further from the trailer and onto the fresh cement that had been poured during the warmer months. I gave up. I'll be honest. I accepted that I was going to die. Then I had heard something unexpected and sickening. Small, furtive movements. Unmistakable vocalizations. Even just from primal grunting and wet groans. I knew it was her young, and I knew it was human. I felt her toxic breath on me before I realized that she had moved. She paused for a second, mapping the wounds she had inflicted so that she could use them again as grips. That was when she dug in so deep into the opening in my shoulder that I could feel her nails and her fingers deep inside the wound. She flung me further across the cement, closer to the sickening, furtive movements. I squeezed my eyes shut. I smelled rancid organic decay and the unmistakable odor of feces. I felt small, fluttering fingers on my neck. Small, little, childlike. I made the inevitable mistake of opening my eyes. I saw dirty blonde hair, tinged with green, draped across a tiny face. Human feet. Baby feet. He was maybe 3, dirty and small. His fingernails were long and sharpened to points. He smiled, and thick mucus stretched across several blackened, sharp teeth. He was missing some, but what remained were crooked, stained and diseased, stuck in purple, rotten gums. Instead of chubby, rosy cheeks, he had hollow, sunken gray skin. The bags under his eyes were purple and veined. Instead of bright, youthful eyes, these were haunted orbs, devoid of color. Faded, milky irises deformed around dark, soulless pupils. He wore what had once been pajamas. Under layers of blood and grime, little trains chugged across his small body in a pattern. The sobs had returned from their hiding place in my chest. I had felt the need to comfort this small, broken doll of a child. That's when he lunged, his broken teeth sinking into my forearm. The pain was unbelievable, bright and loud like the headlights of a truck barreling down on you. I pulled away and heard a horrifying squelching sound as my forearm flesh ripped and hung from his tiny, plump lips. I gagged as he hungrily shoved my skin into his mouth. He ran to the monster, clinging to her body, his stubby hands sinking into her rotten fruit skin. I held my hand tightly against my forearm, watching the blood spill in tributaries between my fingers. It began to snow. Tiny, delicate laceworks fell into and melted against the steaming pool of blood at my feet. A disgusting gurgling sound brought me back, and I watched in horror as the little boy nursed from his mother's surviving breast. Thick blood spilled from the side of his mouth as she gently swept the hair from his face. Years later, I would look up the missing children's database online. I would narrow my search to my state, select the birth year, clumsily guess at the date missing, and it would take me 6 days and 2 breakdowns, but I would find him, along with an inaccurate age progression picture. His parents had named him Mason. He was a twin. He had a baby sister and a dog. He went missing from a family camping trip when he and his brother were one. But I didn't know any of that when I watched him wash down my flesh with bloody breast milk from a demon I hadn't known existed a few hours earlier. Hours earlier, I'd been at the mall, for Christ's sake. The mall with Charles. I guess remembering my brother's body hanging limply across the steering column had jarred me into action. Knowing he wasn't even a football field away from me got me moving. If I could get over the fence, I could make a beeline for Dominic's backyard. I would just have to jump over the mostly frozen creek to get there. Then I could run to his parents' window and have them call the police. I could see the yellow square in the dark that was the sliding glass door to their kitchen from where I was. If I ran through their house as a shortcut, I could run down their driveway, straight down my street to my house. My heart broke a little as I thought of my parents and my sister beginning to worry about us, as we were only a block away fighting for our lives. But if I got to the far end of the fence before the end climbed up, I could get to Charles and keep him safe, keep him warm and talking until the ambulance arrived. Surely somebody had called. The impact on the car was so loud. The other driver surely had a car phone, or maybe a cell phone. Maybe even Yuki's Aikido puppy Moki had heard and was barking up a storm. Maybe the police were already there. For a moment, I thought about grabbing the boy, even if he bit me. I could carry him on my back and get him as far away from her as I could. Maybe even get him home to his family. But even as I stood there, I could barely hold myself up. The world had started to spin around me, blood thickly but steadily pooling on my shoes, my bra, and at the top of my jeans. A few feet from my right lay a rubble pile, not large, but mainly chunks of rebar and concrete. I'd barely made a few inches of progress towards it when a metallic screech again assaulted my senses. My hands covered my ears. I shuffled towards the pile and grabbed a chunk of the rubble, a crude, misshapen, and awkward hammer to wield against the impossible enemy. A rusted, twisted metal handle with a heavy and uneven weight of concrete, hard to hold and even harder to swing. But it was all I had, and I knew it only had to get to the weakest part of her. I only had to incapacitate her long enough to get within earshot of Dominic's house. It couldn't be much past 10 p.m. Someone would have to hear me. I gripped my shoddy weapon tightly to my chest with both hands and felt her swoop down violently as I dove for a cement tunnel, her empty-handed dive throwing her off balance. I scrambled awkwardly towards the far end of the tunnel as I heard her raspy wings pulling her upward before her second strike. Instead of waiting for her to cut me off at the tunnel, I ran as fast as I could, darting from the opening and towards the sickly sweet smell of her nest. The only thing between the fence and me was a bloody baby boy. Blood swirled in my mouth, and a gritty, sharp feeling forced me to spit. I don't know why the image of my tooth and my hand covered in blood triggered a response in me, but it did. I knew I was dying. Not just that I was going to die, that this monster my parents had never imagined in their worst nightmares would take their daughter away forever, and they would never see my body or have anything to bury, but that I currently was actively dying. The damage to my ribs, my lungs, my spleen, my arm would kill me if the blood loss or hypothermia didn't do it first. I knew I was dying, and it turned me into a monster too. I ran, not straight for the fence, but for her nest. I could hear her above me, barreling down. I ran right towards that little boy and swung a 20-pound chunk of concrete down on his tiny hand, smashing it to the ground. The sound he made wakes me up at night sometimes. His screams were animal-like, and dropped my weapon to cover my ears. The rusted metal scream from the sky crashed down like a bomb, and I ran. I didn't look back. I ran to the fence. With all the strength I had left, I pulled myself up, shoving my foot into a diamond-shaped hole made by the chain link. I'd hopped 1,000 fences this way in my life, and to this day I'm grateful I had the experience. My bleeding hands found the frozen horizontal pipe at the top of the fence and groaned in pain as I hefted myself over. All the fence-hopping experience in the world wouldn't have made climbing with shattered ribs and bleeding flanks any less impossible, and I could only crash to the ground. Both ankles jarred into the frozen ground, and my scream stuck in my throat, caught on blood and bile, escaping only as a choking sob. Her violent, crazed screams were still on the ground as she tended to her baby. I didn't let guilt slow me down. I ran as fast as I could for maybe 6 feet before my ankles gave out. Dominic's house was all I could see, a tunnel of black closing in on my vision. I never looked back. I gripped my fingers into the frosty ground, pulling myself up. I hobbled, sprinting towards the dark field. The night sky above me swirled with snow flurries. My busted, bloody fingers fumbled at my jacket zipper. I could see the flickering blue glow of the late-night TV coming from Mr. and Mrs. Rossi's bedroom. The tunnel grew smaller, and I could see less and less. Bawling, I forced my arms out of the jacket as I reached the banks of the creek. Dominic and I had spent summers of our childhood testing the width of the creek along its entirety, and I knew that the bend behind his house was not jumpable. My toes slipped over the crest of the land, and a razor-sharp talon slashed at my hands. I screamed and swung my jacket into the writhing storm of limbs and wings above me. Feeling solid impact on one of the swings, I let go of the jacket and flung myself across the frozen creek, landing with about a foot left, my feet crushing through the glass-thin ice as my ankles crumbled beneath me. I could only see a pinhole in front of me, a flickering blue of TV light. I could hear her above me, diving down finally for the kill, her metallic scream and the deafening boom of Mr. Rossi's handgun, the one I'd never even known he had. He was standing on the back porch, one hand over his head, gun pointed to the sky. Mrs. Rossi stood next to me, Dominic's baseball hat in her hand. The last thing I saw was the golden warm glow of the Rossi's kitchen, and the pinhole closing as the world darkened around me. I've read the statement Mr. and Mrs. Rossi gave the police, that they heard what they thought were animal noises behind the house, but when they opened the back door, they heard human screams as well. They saw a large, dark shape in the night, but only a second later they saw my body slumped over, my fingers barely making it to their property. They had called 911, and then my parents. The ambulance had brought my brother and the other driver to the hospital, and it only arrived 30 minutes before mine did. My dad had run to the Rossi's house while my poor, confused, frantic mother rode to the hospital with Cammie and our neighbor. When my dad and I recently recalled the events of that night, I cried hearing the usual funny, goofy man choke up, remembering seeing me slumped over Mrs. Rossi like a rag doll, her white robe covered in my blood. He said that my face was so bruised and swollen that he thought an animal had mauled me. He wasn't exactly wrong. Mr. Rossi had stood guard with the bat until the police and EMTs arrived. Animal control didn't press me too hard. In fact, the vaguer and foggier my memory was, the happier they seemed. I knew that if I told the truth, I'd be locked up, medicated, or assumed to be a victim of something else. A monster woman from the sky? Before I could have even said it out loud, I knew better and feigned memory loss. To this day, the official story is 2 cars on Pondside were struck by a wild animal, and the passenger of one of the cars was attacked and dragged by the animal until a neighbor heard the commotion and fired a gun, scaring it off. While I was in the hospital, a handful of flowers, candles, and teddy bears were left at the stop sign. Charlie doesn't remember anything. He says the last thing he can recall is running to the car in the parking lot and turning the heat on, before pulling the car around for me. I'm actually happy this is the last thing that he remembers. I wonder if he's telling the truth, though. Cammie would come in my room at night for years. She would sit on the floor next to my bed with her fuzzy Disney blanket wrapped around her shoulders. She knew the whole story from beginning to end, even about Mason, a detail I had kept from my parents. Cam and I would stay up together until the sun came up, our eyes locked on the windows in my room, the one facing the south. Some nights, she would get in bed with me, both of us sitting with our backs against the wall, our shoulders resting on one another's, both of us looking at the window, scanning every inch of the blue-gray pitch until morning's first light, searching for a growing speck of black. My parents, proud pacifists, had purchased a gun each, and a few years later they had Cammy and I in judo classes. But the best thing they did was believe me. Even that first night, after the first surgery, they had listened intently, never interrupting or telling me I was imagining things or lying. However, it was made very clear that while our home was a safe space, we weren't to talk about it outside the walls. I know she's still out there. I know Mason is too. Even after I moved away, my mom would send newspaper articles, first clippings in the mail, then eventually links and text messages as time went on. Police blotters about animal attacks, missing dogs, unexplained accidents, missing blonde boys. She took one every few years from different areas, and I thought initially maybe she had killed or eaten Mason once he was too old, until I saw them both one night. I'd heard the whistle, and I didn't even need to look up, but I did. But that's a story for another time. I'd been a hunter for most of my life leading up to this incident. The smell of the warm air and the beauty of nature always had me at ease. I never felt scared alone at night in the woods because I had seen everything there is to be scared of. I've seen bears the size of small cars, animals so vicious that they'll kill anything that moves. The one thing I was never scared of was deer. I'd heard the tales of skinwalkers and wendigos and pretty much anything in between. My uncle was an expert on tracking and hunting. We always went on trips together and would always come back with a fresh kill. He did have a rule, though. I remember it so vividly because it was weird. He never wanted to go hunting in winter. I never asked why. I don't know, but something about it always had me on edge. One day during winter, I was about to go deer hunting when my uncle stopped me at the front door. When he came in, he saw my packed supplies and my rifle and knew I was about to go hunting. He immediately burst into a wrath of anger and dragged me to the wall to get into my face. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" he said, spittle flying all over my face as he looked at me crazy. He looked primal, as if he was fearful of something that he didn't want to share. It's the same face you would expect a child to make if he was dumped in the middle of nowhere. The face of fear, you see, in people who have PTSD. I calmly brushed him off and got to the door, saying I was going hunting. I was not about to fight with my uncle and ruin the trip, as I hadn't gone hunting for close to a month. When you hunt, you get adjusted to it, and when you go on break, you kind of miss it. As I got in my truck, my uncle peered at me out the window. He was there to take care of my house, but before I reversed, he left with the door open. My uncle's prone to outburst. As I should mention, he's only ever done it a few times, and it's always in a situation where the reaction suits it. Not this one, though. This one was bad, and I wondered what was so bad about hunting in the winter. The spot I'd planned was an isolated one. It was a very heavily forested area, which I hadn't been to before. I obviously had mapped the area out and brought essential survival tools in case the worst came, but I never thought I'd have to use it after all those years out in the woods. When I arrived, the crisp cold air immediately saturated me in discomfort. I quickly got another layer of clothes on before I started to walk to where I would set up camp for the night. The clearing I had chosen was a pretty tight one. There was a big tree in the center that stood tall above the rest. It was called the Forest Star, which suited it. Around the clearing, the forest was extremely dense. Almost no sun shone through the top. There was a small hunting tower north of the entrance of the clearing, so it was a direct walk from the camp. As I walked ahead, I noticed something. There were very small droplets of blood littering the ground. My first thought was that it must be from an injured animal or something. but the droplets were small and evenly placed. I shook the thought out of my head and made it to my setup as I started to pin my tent. When I was done, I checked my watch. It was about 5:30 p.m. I had about 2 hours for hunting before it was pitch black, so I made it to the tower. When I undid my rifle from the case, I heard scraping. Shaking it off, I took position and waited. As I stood there, time almost seemed to slow down. I was in a precise focus, was ready for anything. I wasn't ready for what I saw, though. Out came 2 bucks that seemed injured. There were small droplets of blood coming from their eyes. As I focused in, I saw that it wasn't dried blood either. It was fresh, and it was oozing from their eyes. I was shocked. I'd never seen anything like it. Multiple scenarios ran through my head. Had a hunter shot both of them in the eye and managed not to kill them? But each scenario seemed more unlikely than the last. I took aim at the closest one and shot it. It stood there for a second, just not moving. Then they trotted off as if nothing had happened. Blood was running from the wound, so I'd obviously hit it, but it didn't seem scared or fazed. I decided that was enough and sort of jogged to my site. I was freaking out and decided that I'd cook dinner and go to bed early. When I got back to camp, I pulled out a tin of beans, grabbed a pot, and started a fire so I could cook them. As I cracked open a beer, the familiar sound of a branch snapping sounded off next to me. I brushed it off as I sat back to relax, thinking it was probably a small deer. I was thinking about the deer as I started to chalk it up to the fact that I must not have hit deep, and the deer was in shock. When I finished eating, I went to bed. I was shivering in the night cold, and I could hear my body shaking uncontrollably. As I dozed off after a brutal 2 hours of cold, I heard another snap. This time, it was a lot louder, though, like a bear. I immediately grabbed my rifle and got out of the tent. My fire was burning low, and in the distance, I saw 2 red lights. I walked towards them when my mind started to race. Something felt wrong. As I closed the distance, my guts were literally twisted. My mind was anxious, and I felt like I was about to break down. Then I realized what was wrong. Those weren't lights. They were 2 big, beady, solid red eyes. There were no pupils. They were just orbs hovering. I stood frozen in realization. I thought it was a big cat, but what emerged was much worse. Its fur was black, darker than the night around us. Its antlers grew twisted and uneven, but the worst part was it was crying blood. Deep red droplets were pelting down its unnatural face. I couldn't make a sound. I was frozen in fear. Then it made a sound like a baby crying. It was horrible. The sound of unnatural wails filled the cold air, making it worse. My body felt crumpled, so I finally broke out into a sprint. When I looked back, it was still there. It wasn't even breathing, but the sound of that baby crying wasn't fading. It was like a speaker was attached to my ear. When I made it to the camp, I rushed to pack my stuff. In a hurry, I ran, leaving the tent behind, and rushed onto my truck. As I fumbled with the keys, I saw that something was walking slowly towards me. That's when the whispering started. Terrible, faint voices echoed throughout the forest as my mind started to close. I felt my cerebral melting as I sat there in a kind of sleep paralysis. I found the strength to finally open the door and get in my car. I slammed it shut, and that thing was right at the window. I started to sob as I jammed the key in the ignition. My mind felt fried, and I swerved out of there. I didn't care if I hit anything. I just wanted to be away from that thing. Before I could properly back out, it stood on its legs, and it repeated a voice I recognized. You do not escape this. The forests are mine. It was my grandpa's voice. He died when I was 6, and I never knew any of the details. The thing then made a howl, a terrible shrieking howl that hurt my entire body. As it did so, I heard scampering as more of those things came out. They had blood running from their eyes as well. The baby cries started again, and that's when I finally drove out of that place. When I raced home, I immediately barged into my door. My shoulder ached, but I didn't care. I shoved the door and locked it and ran into the kitchen. That's when I saw my uncle sitting at the table, enjoying a glass of scotch. "So, you saw what I did, didn't you, Anthony?" I couldn't form words. I was so shocked. My uncle came up to me and put a hand on my shoulder. "What you saw out there is my rule I abide by. There are things in those forests in winter that are so horrible even the most seasoned can't handle it. I saw it when I was a boy, and since then I don't hunt during the winter." I finally mustered a sentence. "What was it?" He took a deep breath before sitting down. "You saw something called the Urabarak. It's an ancient being that dwells in the forest during these winters. Hunters who see it usually are never the same again, but some never come back home. I was lucky." My uncle sort of sniffed as he told me about his encounter with the Urabarak. "When I was 23, my father and I went out into the woods on a very cold winter to hunt. Our family was struggling, so we didn't have much food. When we were hunting, my dad called out to me, but before I could even get to him, I heard him yell out before he went silent. I never saw him again, but what stood there was worse than the loss of my own. A deer with red eyes, black fur, and twisted antlers stood there. Blood ran from its eyes. Then it started to cry like a baby." My uncle broke down and had to take a few seconds before continuing. I comforted him as I was teary-eyed too. It ran after me, Anthony, on two legs. It was like a human, and I rushed to get away from it. But I wasn't quick enough." He rolled up his sleeve and revealed a terrible red scar that ran across the entire underside of his arm. It was trying to feast on me. It knew I feared it, but eventually I managed to lose it. He finally finished his scotch before continuing. "I was stuck in those woods for 3 days, fighting to survive. I heard its cries and whispers all around as I tried to make it out. I finally arrived at the road and was taken in by police. No trace was ever found of my dad, except for one thing. They found blood at the scene and tested it. It was my father's. What was strange about it is it was mixed with his tears." My uncle finally stood up. "Fear it, for it knows who you are." Those were his last words. He left my house, and the police found him wrapped up in a noose 2 days later. It broke me. My hunting buddy and best friend was gone. There was one detail about his suicide that was never resolved. He had droplets of blood coming from his eyes. The coroner inspected it and said it had been an aneurysm, but I'm not so sure that's the truth. I'm 50 now, and I haven't been hunting in 2 decades. I can't even go into the forest anymore. I'm thinking about going back and seeing what Urabarak is. Maybe I can kill him. Beware the Urabarak, for he lurks in the cold.